How does a nation, founded on the sacred principle of liberty, turn its guns upon itself? How does a government, built on compromise and debate, collapse into a war of brother versus brother? For 4 harrowing years, from 1861 to 1865, the United States was a house tragically divided. This is the story of America's greatest crisis, the defining, bloody epic that tested the very concept of American identity. To truly understand the war, you must first understand the fundamental divergence of the two worlds that existed side by side. The North, stretching from New England's granite shores through the bustling industrial centers of Pennsylvania and Ohio, was rapidly evolving into an industrial and commercial powerhouse. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were magnets for millions of immigrants, swelling the ranks of its urban working class. Its economy was dynamic, fueled by mills, factories, railroads, and finance. The notion of work was built on wage labor, where a man sold his time, but theoretically controlled his destiny. The South, however, remained fundamentally agrarian, a vast landscape of sprawling farms and massive plantations. Its economic destiny was inextricably linked to cash crops, primarily cotton. This single crop, often referred to as king cotton, dominated global markets and dictated every aspect of Southern society. Its wealth was tangible, visible in the land and the ownership of human beings. The value of Southern property was, in large part, calculated by the market price of enslaved people. This created two utterly distinct economic philosophies, which would inevitably collide. The North's dynamism thrived on free markets and free labor. The South's stability depended entirely on unfree labor and a rigid hierarchy. Over the next hour, we will move beyond simple explanations of states' rights versus slavery. We will trace the path from the fragile compromises of the early republic to the outright secession of 1861. We will meticulously examine the political, moral, and economic seeds of conflict, seeds sown decades before the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter. We will then witness the defining military campaigns, the transformative leadership of Lincoln and Grant, and finally, the profound, bloody consequences that ultimately forced the nation's rebirth. This is the tragic epic that, through fire and blood, redefined the very essence of American freedom. The defining characteristic, the insurmountable obstacle to peace, was the institution of racial slavery. We must understand that for the planter elite of the South, slavery was not merely a labor system. It was a deeply ingrained social, cultural, and political pillar. They saw it as necessary for their economy and even a positive good for the enslaved people, a twisted justification that history soundly rejects. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 dramatically cemented the South's commitment to slavery. Suddenly, the laborious process of separating seed from cotton fiber was mechanized, making short staple cotton hugely profitable. Demand from British and New England textile mills exploded, creating a ravenous hunger for land and labor. As cotton production surged, so did the price of an enslaved person. This wasn't a declining institution. It was a massively profitable, expanding enterprise. The political power of the South was directly tied to the system. The infamous 3/5 Compromise, dating back to the Constitution's drafting, gave Southern states disproportionate representation in Congress based on counting 3/5 of their enslaved population. This meant that the votes of Southern white men held more weight in national politics than votes in the North. This political leverage was used relentlessly to protect and expand slavery into new Western territories. For the enslaved, the reality was relentless brutality. It was a life defined by forced labor, the constant threat of violence, and the ultimate horror of family separation through sale. The stories of escapees like Frederick Douglass and the conductors of the Underground Railroad revealed the true, inhumane face of the system to the North. Douglas, a brilliant orator and writer, powerfully argued that the nation could not reconcile its founding declarations of equality with the systemic dehumanization of millions. As his voice amplified, the moral chasm between the sections widened into an impassable gulf. For 30 years, the political establishment attempted to solve the slavery question through political gymnastics. These efforts, while delaying war, only proved that the issue was fundamentally uncompromisable. The first major attempt was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. When the territory of Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, it threatened the delicate balance of power in the Senate. The solution, engineered by Henry Clay, was a temporary fix. Missouri would enter as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and slavery would be prohibited in all remaining Louisiana Purchase territory north of the 3630 parallel. It was a clear, if temporary, geographical boundary for an abstract moral issue. Thomas Jefferson famously looked upon this compromise with dread, writing that it was like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. 30 years later, the acquisition of vast new territories from the Mexican-American War reopened the wound. The Compromise of 1850 was even more sprawling and complex. It involved admitting California as a free state, settling the Texas boundary dispute, and allowing the territories of Utah and New Mexico to decide the slavery question later through popular sovereignty. But the most explosive part was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 effectively federalized the hunt for escaped slaves. It denied fugitives the right to a jury trial and compelled Northern citizens, regardless of their personal morality, to assist in the capture and return of escaped persons. This was a direct, inescapable intrusion of the slave system into the free states. It radicalized the North, turning many moderates into staunch anti-slavery advocates. This law was a spectacular political miscalculation by the South. Intended to secure their property, it instead alienated an entire population. The literary response to the act further inflamed tensions. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, became a runaway bestseller, exposing the emotional cruelty of slavery to a mass audience. It was a fictional work, but it galvanized abolitionist sentiment like no political treatise could, painting the institution not as an economic inevitability, but as a moral abomination.
If the Compromise of 1850 was a Band-Aid, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was the surgeon's knife that ripped the fragile compromises apart. Championed by Senator Stephen Douglas, this act formally repealed the Missouri Compromise line and introduced the principle of popular sovereignty, allowing the residents of the Kansas and Nebraska territories to vote on whether to permit slavery. The theory was democratic. The reality was anarchy. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, determined to dominate the vote. This led directly to Bleeding Kansas, a terrifying, low-grade civil war fought in the prairies. Settlers from both sides armed themselves, set up rival governments, and engaged in acts of murder, arson, and terror. The sack of Lawrence and John Brown's retaliatory massacre at Pottawatomie Creek demonstrated that Americans were now willing to kill each other over the issue of slavery, proving that political negotiation was dead. The violence even spread to the halls of Congress. In 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a fiery speech denouncing slavery and several Southern senators. 2 days later, Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina assaulted Sumner on the Senate floor with a heavy cane, nearly killing him. Brooks became a Southern hero, receiving replacement canes from supporters. Sumner became a Northern martyr. The incident symbolized the breakdown of recent debate. Dialogue was replaced by violence, and respect by brute force. Finally, the Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court decision of 1857 delivered the constitutional death blow. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, in a deeply flawed decision, ruled 3 things. First, that people of African descent, enslaved or free, were not and could never be citizens. Second, that the federal government had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, thus invalidating the Missouri Compromise line once and for all. And third, that slaves were property, protected by the Constitution. This decision outraged the North, which saw it as an illegitimate attempt to nationalize slavery. The South, triumphant, now believed the Constitution was unequivocally on their side. The path to secession was now clear. The final crisis awaited. The 1860 presidential election was a four-way contest that shattered the last remaining national party, the Democrats. The South, deeply fragmented, nominated two different candidates who were willing to protect slavery. The North rallied behind the newly formed Republican Party, which nominated Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's platform was simple and clear. He would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, but he would absolutely oppose its expansion into any new territory. For the South, this was unacceptable. If slavery could not expand, they believed it would eventually be suffocated and die. The outcome was foreordained by the North's greater population. Lincoln won the presidency without receiving a single electoral vote from the Deep South. To the fire eaters, the ardent secessionists, this was the final signal. They viewed Lincoln's election not as a defeat, but as a revolutionary act by the North. They believed the time for compromise was over. The time for independence had arrived. On December 20th, 1860, 6 weeks after the election, South Carolina formally repealed its ratification of the Constitution and declared itself an independent nation. The ceremony was jubilant, marked by fireworks and cheering crowds. By February 1861, 6 other states of the Deep South, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed suit. These states swiftly formed the Confederate States of America, adopted a constitution nearly identical to the U.S. Constitution, but explicitly protecting slavery, and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. The fragile Union, established in 1787, was shattered. The stage was set for the opening scene of the war. The crisis reached its inescapable crescendo at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. By April 1861, the federal garrison, led by Major Robert Anderson, was isolated and running low on supplies within the territory of the newly formed Confederacy. Confederate President Jefferson Davis faced a stark choice: allow the U.S. presence to remain, an unacceptable humiliation, or attack, thereby initiating war. The Confederacy chose the latter. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on the fort. For 34 hours, the bombardment continued. No Union soldiers were killed in the fighting, but the attack served its purpose. It formalized the conflict. When Major Anderson surrendered, the Confederacy had its first victory, but at the cost of igniting the collective fury of the North. Lincoln's response was immediate. He called for 75,000 state militia volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This was the point of no return. Lincoln's call forced the remaining upper southern states, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee, to choose a side. Unwilling to raise troops to fight their neighbors, they too seceded. This dramatic expansion of the conflict was strategically devastating for the Union, as it lost crucial industrial and agricultural resources, and, most importantly, the military talent of leaders like Robert E. Lee, who chose loyalty to his home state of Virginia over the United States Army. The initial enthusiasm on both sides was infectious. Northern volunteers signed up expecting a quick, decisive battle that would send the rebels home. The first major confrontation came in July 1861 at Bull Run near Manassas, Virginia. Overconfident Union forces, pressed by public demand and media hype,
marched out of Washington, D.C., some accompanied by civilian spectators carrying picnic baskets, eager to witness the glorious end of the war. The battle was a chaotic, brutal awakening. Though the Union initially pushed the Confederates back, the tide turned when Brigadier General Thomas Jackson held his ground like a stone wall, earning him his legendary moniker. The Confederate counterattack routed the Union Army, sending panicked soldiers and civilians streaming back toward Washington, D.C. The reality hit the Union with brutal force. This would not be a short war. It would be a prolonged, bloody struggle demanding total commitment and professional leadership. The Confederacy gained a surge of confidence, while the North was forced to reorganize and face the gravity of the task ahead. Lincoln installed Major General George B. McClellan to train and lead the newly formed Army of the Potomac. McClellan was a superb organizer, but his caution and reluctance to engage the enemy would prove to be a source of constant frustration for the aggressive Lincoln. While the war in the East became a stalemate defined by McClellan's reluctance, the war in the West, the vast territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, was defined by decisive Union action, thanks primarily to one man, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was a seemingly unimpressive figure, a quiet, often sloppily dressed officer whose pre-war life was marked by failure. But on the battlefield, he possessed an iron will, strategic clarity, and an aggressive determination to seek out and destroy the enemy. He grasped a vital truth. This war would be won not by capturing capitals, but by controlling resources and destroying Confederate armies. In February 1862, Grant launched a brilliant campaign to capture Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee, key Confederate river defenses. When the Confederate commander at Donelson asked for terms of surrender, Grant famously replied, "No terms, except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted." The victory not only earned him his nickname Unconditional Surrender, Grant, but opened up the state of Tennessee for Union invasion, forcing the Confederacy to abandon key positions. This aggression led to the horrific Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Named for a small church in Tennessee, Shiloh was an unprecedented bloodbath. A surprise Confederate attack nearly destroyed Grant's forces on the first day. Grant, despite suffering massive casualties, refused to retreat. He reorganized his shattered troops overnight and launched a counterattack the next morning, forcing the Confederates to withdraw. Shiloh resulted in over 23,000 casualties combined, more than all previous American wars combined up to that point. The sheer scale of the carnage shocked the nation, confirming the true destructive nature of the Civil War. Grant's grit under fire, however, marked him as the Union's most promising, if costly, general. Back in the Eastern Theater, the Union's main effort was the Peninsula Campaign, spring 1862, led by McClellan. Despite having an army twice the size of the Confederate forces defending Richmond, McClellan's characteristic overcautiousness and his persistent belief that the enemy outnumbered him led to frustrating delays and missed opportunities. His reluctance to press the attack allowed Confederate forces, now under the brilliant, audacious command of Robert E. Lee, to constantly outmaneuver him. Lee, though a reluctant secessionist, was a master tactician who possessed an uncanny ability to read his opponents. He took advantage of McClellan's inertia, successfully defending the Confederate capital of Richmond through the 7 Days battles. This Confederate success, despite immense logistical disadvantages, solidified Lee's reputation and further demoralized the North. Lincoln was forced to pull McClellan's massive army back to Washington, abandoning the entire costly campaign. The frustration over the Eastern failures pushed Lincoln closer to employing a more radical war strategy. The summer of 1862 saw Lee seize the initiative, launching his first invasion of the North into Maryland. Lee's goal was to gain a decisive victory on Union soil, which he hoped would encourage European recognition of the Confederacy or force the Union to negotiate peace. The resulting clash was the Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg, on September 17, 1862, a day of unparalleled carnage in American history. McClellan, by sheer luck, discovered Lee's battle plans wrapped around lost cigars. Despite this intelligence, he approached the battle tentatively. The fighting, concentrated over a few crucial points, the cornfield, the sunken road or bloody lane, and Burnside's bridge, was a sustained, brutal exchange that cost over 23,000 casualties combined, making it the bloodiest single day in the war. Though Lee's invasion was halted and he was forced to retreat back to Virginia, McClellan failed yet again to pursue and destroy the crippled Confederate army. Militarily, it was a draw. However, politically, the Union's ability to force Lee's retreat was decisive. It gave President Lincoln the crucial, if costly, victory he desperately needed to execute his most transformative war measure. The retreat from Antietam was the trigger. On September 22, 1862, President Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This act fundamentally and irrevocably transformed the nature of the Civil War. Prior to this, Lincoln's stated goal was primarily the preservation of the Union. Now, it was officially and legally a war for human freedom. The proclamation, which took effect on January 1, 1863, declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held states were thenceforward and forever free. Crucially, it did not apply to the border slave states that remained loyal to the Union, like Kentucky and Maryland, or to Confederate territory already controlled by the Union, as Lincoln lacked the constitutional authority there. He acted under his authority as commander-in-chief. It was a military measure designed to weaken the rebellion by stripping the Confederacy of its labor force. The impact was enormous. It immediately turned the Union Army into an army of liberation in the eyes of the enslaved, encouraging thousands to flee to Union lines. It opened the door for black men to formally join the Union Army and Navy, with nearly 200,000 African Americans eventually serving in the United States Colored Troops, USCT, often in segregated units, but fighting with unparalleled fervor for their own liberty. For the first time, they were officially part of the fight for the Union's future. Internationally, the proclamation sealed the Confederacy's fate. European powers, particularly Great Britain, which had already abolished slavery and whose industrial workers strongly opposed it, could no longer justify intervening on behalf of the Confederacy. The war was now a moral crusade against slavery, making formal support for the South a political impossibility for any European democracy. While the world was reeling from the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army was fighting to control the vast American heartland. The key lay in the Mississippi River, the vital artery of the continent, which the Confederacy used to transport goods and troops. The only remaining Confederate stronghold on the river was the heavily fortified city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, perched high on bluffs overlooking a sharp bend in the river. General Ulysses S. Grant recognized that Vicksburg was the nail-head that holds the South's two halves together. After months of failed attempts to approach the city directly, Grant executed a bold, highly unconventional maneuver in the spring of 1863. He moved his army south of Vicksburg, marched them across the river, and cut his supply lines, a move considered militarily reckless. He then launched a brilliant, rapid campaign, attacking and defeating Confederate forces inland before they could unite to defend the city. This audacious Vicksburg campaign culminated in a siege of the city that lasted 47 days. The residents and Confederate soldiers suffered terribly from hunger and constant bombardment. On July 4, 1863, the Confederate commander surrendered. The Union now controlled the entire Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy into two economically and militarily distinct halves. The victory at Vicksburg was strategically immense, permanently crippling the Confederacy's ability to wage war. Just one day after Vicksburg fell, another colossal struggle, one that would etch itself permanently into the nation's memory, reached its bloody climax in Pennsylvania. General Robert E. Lee,
emboldened by his stunning victory at Chancellorsville, had launched his second, more ambitious invasion of the North, seeking to relieve the pressure on Vicksburg and win a decisive victory on Union soil that would force a negotiated peace. The three-day Battle of Gettysburg, July 1 through 3, 1863, was the largest and costliest battle ever fought in North America. The clash was accidental, beginning when Confederate forces encountered Union cavalry near the small town. The fighting quickly escalated into a desperate struggle for key terrain, particularly the hills known as Little Round Top and Cemetery Ridge. On the third and final day, Lee made the most fateful decision of his career. Despite the tactical failures of the first 2 days, he ordered a massive frontal assault of over 12,000 Confederate troops, known as Pickett's Charge, across 3/4 of a mile of open ground toward the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. It was an act of profound desperation and misplaced faith. The charge was a catastrophic failure. Union artillery and infantry fire tore through the Confederate lines, turning the field into a slaughterhouse. Only a few hundred men even reached the Union line, and they were quickly overwhelmed. Lee's army suffered devastating, irreplaceable losses, over 28,000 casualties in 3 days. Retreating back to Virginia, Lee would never again possess the strength to mount a major offensive. Gettysburg is rightfully called the high watermark of the Confederacy, the farthest point their bid for independence ever reached. 4 months after the battle, President Lincoln visited Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery for the Union dead. What he delivered there, the Gettysburg Address, was neither a lengthy oration nor a military analysis. It was a brief, profound articulation of the war's ultimate purpose, instantly becoming one of the most powerful statements of democratic principle ever uttered. In just 272 words, Lincoln redefined the American experiment. He framed the war not simply as a fight to preserve the Union, but as a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal can long endure. Most crucially, he spoke of a new birth of freedom, linking the sacrifice of the dead directly to the promise of emancipation and true equality. The address elevated the conflict from a mere civil war to a universal struggle for the highest ideals of self-governance. While the battle settled the military question, the address settled the moral and philosophical question. The preserved Union would be one based on liberty and equality for all, not one sustained by human bondage. The very character of the United States was transformed in that small Pennsylvania field. With the twin victories of Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Lincoln finally had the general he desperately needed. In March 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was brought east, promoted to general-in-chief of all Union armies, and was given command to implement a coordinated, decisive strategy. Grant understood that the Confederacy was dying, and he intended to hasten its demise through a relentless, unified offensive, a strategy often termed total war. Grant's plan was simple: use the Union's overwhelming advantage in manpower and industry to destroy the Confederacy's ability to resist simultaneously on all fronts. His main objective was to engage Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and keep pressure on them, preventing them from maneuvering or aiding other Confederate forces. The ensuing campaign, known as the Overland Campaign, was a terrifying, continuous series of battles unlike any seen before. Starting with the Battle of the Wilderness, then Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor, Grant sustained horrific losses, sometimes referred to as Grant's slaughters. But unlike previous Union generals who retreated after such defeats, Grant refused to disengage. After every defeat, he simply sidestepped Lee's defenses and kept moving south, keeping the pressure on. At Cold Harbor, he suffered 7,000 casualties in less than an hour, but his grim determination earned him the moniker the Butcher and, critically, broke the will of Lee's army.
By June 1864, Grant had maneuvered his army to Petersburg, Virginia, trapping Lee in a brutal 9-month siege of Petersburg. The siege directly threatened the Confederate capital of Richmond and effectively turned the rest of the war into a slow, inevitable grind, draining the Confederacy of its last resources. With the twin victories of Vicksburg and Gettysburg, Lincoln finally had the general he desperately needed. In March 1864, Ulysses S. Grant was brought east, promoted to general-in-chief of all Union armies, and was given command to implement a coordinated, decisive strategy. Grant understood that the Confederacy was dying, and he intended to hasten its demise through a relentless, unified offensive, a strategy often termed total war. Grant's plan was simple. Use the Union's overwhelming advantage in manpower and industry to destroy the Confederacy's ability to resist simultaneously on all fronts. His main objective was to engage Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and keep pressure on them, preventing them from maneuvering or aiding other Confederate forces. The ensuing campaign, known as the Overland Campaign, was a terrifying, continuous series of battles unlike any seen before, starting with the Battle of the Wilderness, then Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor. Grant sustained horrific losses, sometimes referred to as Grant's slaughters. But unlike previous Union generals who retreated after such defeats, Grant refused to disengage. After every defeat, he simply sidestepped Lee's defenses and kept moving south, keeping the pressure on. At Cold Harbor, he suffered 7,000 casualties in less than an hour, but his grim determination earned him the moniker the Butcher, and, critically, broke the will of Lee's army. By June 1864, Grant had maneuvered his army to Petersburg, Virginia, trapping Lee in a brutal 9-month siege of Petersburg. This siege directly threatened the Confederate capital of Richmond and effectively turned the rest of the war into a slow, inevitable grind, draining the Confederacy of its last resources. The second crucial part of Grant's total war strategy was executed by his most trusted subordinate, General William T. Sherman. While Grant was pinning down Lee, Sherman was given command of the Western armies, with one goal: destroy the Confederacy's ability to sustain the war, both materially and psychologically. Sherman executed his famous campaign by first capturing and devastating the vital railroad hub of Atlanta in September 1864. This victory was a major turning point, not only militarily, but politically. By the summer of 1864, the North, exhausted by Grant's high casualties and the war's apparent endlessness, was deeply disillusioned. Lincoln faced a difficult re-election against former General McClellan, who ran on a peace platform. The fall of Atlanta, a massive, tangible victory, revitalized Northern morale and ensured Lincoln's re-election in November. This single victory guaranteed that the war would continue until the Confederacy was totally defeated. Following Atlanta, Sherman executed the terrifying March to the Sea. He cut his army loose from its supply lines and marched 60,000 men across 285 miles of Georgia farmland to the port city of Savannah. They destroyed railroads, seized livestock, burned homes, and dismantled the civilian infrastructure supporting the Confederate war machine. Sherman stated his goal was to make Georgia howl. This was not wanton destruction. It was a calculated strategy to demonstrate to the Southern populace that the Confederate government could no longer protect them, thereby breaking their will to fight. The march was brutally effective. It demoralized the South, stripped their forces of necessary supplies, and freed tens of thousands of enslaved people who flocked to Sherman's columns. After taking Savannah, Sherman turned north, commencing the even more destructive Carolinas campaign, aimed at punishing South Carolina, the state that had led the secession movement. By early 1865, the outcome of the war was uncertainty. General Grant's massive Union armies held General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a deadly embrace at Petersburg, while General Sherman's forces were devastating the Carolinas. Lee's supplies dwindled, his troops deserted, and the Confederacy's last hope was to break out of Petersburg and link up with the remaining forces under General Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina. On April 2, 1865, the Union forces finally broke Lee's lines at Petersburg, forcing the immediate evacuation of both Petersburg and the Confederate capital, Richmond. The fleeing Confederate government and its army were now desperate, exhausted, and starving. Grant launched a relentless, final pursuit, preventing Lee from escaping southward. The end came swiftly and dramatically. On April 9th, 1865, cornered and with his army utterly spent, General Robert E. Lee met with General Ulysses S. Grant at the parlor of the Wilmer McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The meeting was marked with quiet dignity and respect. Lee, immaculate in his dress uniform, and Grant, dressed simply and splattered with mud, negotiated the terms of surrender. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers were allowed to keep their sidearms and, crucially, their horses and mules for the spring planting. This act of grace was designed to encourage reconciliation and ensure that the war was truly over, both militarily and psychologically. The cannons fell silent, the Union was saved, the institution of slavery was dead. The nation's moment of triumph was swiftly followed by an unspeakable tragedy. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was shot by the ardent Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln died the next morning. The shock of the assassination was catastrophic. Lincoln, the man who had guided the nation through its darkest hour with unparalleled patience, resolve, and magnanimity, most clearly articulated in his second inaugural address, was gone. His death immediately complicated the immense task that lay ahead: Reconstruction. Lincoln had already outlined a forgiving, moderate plan for Reconstruction, famously urging the nation to proceed with malice toward none, with charity for all. His goal was rapid healing and reunification. His death placed the leadership of the nation into the hands of his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat who harbored deep resentment toward the planter elite, but lacked Lincoln's political skill, vision, or genuine commitment to the rights of the newly emancipated. Johnson's weak approach allowed Southern white political power to quickly reassert itself. The funeral procession of Lincoln, a mournful, massive spectacle that traversed the nation from Washington to his home in Springfield, Illinois, underscored the magnitude of the loss. He died a martyr for the Union and a symbol of freedom. His assassination guaranteed that the peace that followed the war would be fragile, bitter, and defined by conflict over the meaning of freedom itself. The period of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, was the nation's attempt to answer the 3 central questions the war had left unresolved. How would the defeated Confederate states be reintegrated into the Union? What rights would the 4 million newly freed people possess? And who would determine the political future of the South? The U.S. Congress, dominated by radical Republicans, understood that only federal intervention could ensure genuine freedom and equality. They passed the monumental 13th, abolishing slavery, 14th, granting citizenship and equal protection, and 15th, guaranteeing voting rights for Black men. These 3 amendments fundamentally changed the U.S. Constitution, permanently aligning it with the ideals of equality Lincoln had articulated at Gettysburg. Federal troops occupied the South to protect Black citizens and Unionist governments. African Americans exercised their newfound rights, voting, holding public office, and creating institutions like schools and churches. For a brief, shining period, the democratic experiment expanded to include all men, regardless of race. However, this progress was met with ferocious, often violent resistance from white Southerners determined to restore racial hierarchy. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terrorism, intimidation, and murder to suppress black voting and force the return of a labor system akin to slavery. Crucially, the North grew weary of the sustained effort required to enforce Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877, a political deal that settled the disputed 1876 presidential election, resulted in the withdrawal of the last remaining federal troops from the South. This act effectively abandoned Southern black citizens to the mercy of state governments, which quickly enacted Jim Crow laws and systemic disenfranchisement that would define American racial relations for the next century. The Civil War remains the costliest conflict in American history. Over 620,000 soldiers died, a figure that, when scaled to today's population, would represent approximately 7 million deaths. Countless others were wounded or maimed. The physical and psychological scars ran deep across both North and South, ensuring that the legacy of the war would be debated and romanticized for generations. Despite the astronomical cost, the war achieved two non-negotiable outcomes. First, it preserved the Union. The constitutional experiment was proven durable. The doctrine of secession was permanently extinguished. The United States would forever function as an indivisible nation, a fundamental reality established by the blood shed at Antietam and Gettysburg. Second, the war destroyed the institution of slavery. It irrevocably ended the moral cancer that had plagued the Republic since its founding. Although true racial equality remained elusive and was delayed by the failures of Reconstruction, the legal, constitutional foundation for a genuinely egalitarian society had been laid. The United States was finally poised, however imperfectly, to live up to the promise of its Declaration of Independence. The Civil War defined the core of modern American governance. It established the supremacy of the federal government over the states, shifted immense power to the executive branch during a time of crisis, and forced the adoption of centralized industrial policies that laid the groundwork for America's rise as a global power in the 20th century. The Civil War was an act of terrible self-destruction that was, paradoxically, an act of creation. It preserved the nation, destroyed its greatest moral blight, and forged a new, more powerful, and ultimately more just republic. It remains the essential, defining event of the American experience.